This doesn't work like science. This works like fiction. Loki, episode 5 from season 2. Science slash fiction. So I said at the end of the previous episode, I don't know where the heck they go from here. The initial, what we start with, felt like the most obvious thing at first. And what I mean by that is, it seems like I'm struggling to think of specific examples off the top of my head, but I know I've seen things where like either an episode of a show or like midway through a movie, like it seemed like everything just ended and then here's the same characters in different circumstances and like they don't know what's going on. And like this is slightly different because Loki does and nobody else does, but the general flavor of like I have seen this before. Like it's still fun to see these characters in different circumstances, except the episode doesn't fully take advantage of that. The only one who has a different personality, at least so far as I can tell from any of the others, is Casey as Frank. Very different personality, but OB seems very much like the same guy. Mobius, I almost said Morbius. Mobius seems very much like the same guy. B15, we don't get enough with her to really get a sense of whether she has the same personality or not. So it seems like, okay, well, you've done this. You haven't done all that much with it. And I started to get nervous that like, oh, okay, like this, it wasn't bad, but I'm like, okay. Like there was good atmosphere, Loki, especially wandering the empty halls of the TVA at the start. Great atmosphere. I didn't realize how claustrophobic and how like every corridor has an arc to it. Nothing is actually straightforward. Well, like something, but very few corridors are straightforward, straight ahead. They're all arcing in some way, which I hadn't really appreciated before until we saw Loki moving through multiple at a time. And I was like, oh, dang, that is kind of neat. So like that was interesting. And then we start to see what everything indicates who the various people who staff the TVA were on their original timelines. So you have Casey is an Alcatraz. You have OB is he's a science professor. Quantum physics, I assume. I think they said that. But his real passion is writing science fiction, and he's not having a lot of luck getting anywhere with that. You have B15 as a doctor. You have Mobius selling jet skis. Huge shock. So you have all these things, and Loki is jumping from reality to reality, from time to time, from place to place, and running into them, but they don't know who he is, and he's the only one who remembers what is going on. I'm like, okay, like this is like, okay, this is fine. But then, when Loki talks with OB, and Loki starts saying like, this is what's happening, or something is brought up was like, well, that's impossible. You should definitely try it. And OB says, well, see, it's impossible with science, but it sounds like it would work in fiction. I really like this. I actually love this. I'm going to call this a leaning on the fourth wall. It's not a fourth wall break because it's not really indicated that OB is realizing that he's literally in a piece of fiction, but he's recognizing the rules that this thing is formulating under follow much more about narrative structure and narrative rules and what would make for a good story, a good piece of fiction, and much less about science. And I actually even kind of like that when Loki's like, well, let's just do science then. And he just starts doing random stuff to see what the result is, like yelling at Loki and hitting him with electricity, see if that provokes a response. And it's a really interesting like little mini commentary on why science fiction is fiction first and foremost, and why you don't go pure science, because pure science is very educational. It's not usually a great story. And I like his sort of understanding of that. But again, it's not a full wall break, but it is kind of leaning on the fourth wall. It's acknowledging it without like the characters fully realizing. So I like that. And I just like that as a way of presenting something like this. I just think that's really cool. And so you naturally have Loki, talk to everybody, be like, I need you. And there was some good bonding between him and Mobius. That scene was really well put together in terms of how he's able to connect with Mobius. We don't get nearly as much with B15 and Casey, but, okay. And then he goes and sees Sylvie. Now, Sylvie also remembers, but doesn't seem to want to help. And then we get the other of the two scenes that make almost all this work, where otherwise it might have been a little bit dull. So the first scene that of these two is the one I already talked about with OB. And then the other one is Sylvie in the bar with Loki. There's basically two things going on here. One of them gets more focus than the other, and the one that gets less focus is actually the thing that I found more interesting. But I'm not saying that as a knock. I'm not saying they focused on the wrong thing. That's just kind of how it is. So what gets more focus is getting Loki to recognize and admit that what he's doing to try and save the TVA ultimately is a selfish act because he wants his friends back. He has friends now, and he doesn't want to lose that. And if he can save the TVA, yes, it might save the timeline, save these branches, do all this other good stuff. But ultimately, he wants it because he wants his friends. He doesn't want to lose what he had. He doesn't want to lose what he feels like he's gained. And recognizing that is pretty important for him. And I like that Sylvie makes it clear, like, yeah, you're selfish, so am I. Like, don't pretend you aren't. That's the thing that gets more focus. The thing that gets less focus, but I love, is the bringing up of choices, of free will. Because Sylvie's thing has been insisting that what she did by killing He Who Remains is giving people choice. Again, these people who staffed the TVA, they were pulled out of their original timelines. They had no choice. They weren't even allowed to know where they came from. I gave them their lives back. Okay, yeah. Maybe, but you didn't give them choice. They didn't choose to return to those lives. Someone like Brad, he was making a choice. But these characters that we're dealing with here, no, they didn't choose this. You sent them back where they came from and never gave them a choice. That kind of matters. And what I really love is that doesn't suddenly paint Sylvie as being wrong, because Sylvie points out the additional complication of, okay, so what are you going to do? Make them aware of the TVA, and now you give them a choice? They can't unknow that. So if they choose not to do it, that's now stuck in their head forever, and you have potentially wrecked what life they were going to have here. But at the same time, maybe in offering that, you're offering them a life that they would rather have, but you won't know unless they have both options. There is no way to unalloy this good. You cannot untaint the situation. You can only choose what the issue with it is. Is the issue they're in the TVA and didn't choose to be there? Is the issue they're on their original timelines and didn't choose to be there? Or is the issue you give them a choice, but in doing so, you taint either experience, whichever one they choose? Because now they have the knowledge that maybe they weren't meant to have. There's no clean answer. There's no clean solution, but I love that it brings up the contradictions and the issues. And I love that it doesn't have a clean answer, because as much as narratives and philosophy often try and find the answer, like, these things don't have clean answers. They don't. They're messy. And this is messy, and it's acknowledging it. And I love it. I love it so much. Which is a shame that there's a scene a little bit later that I really think they messed up. I think they made a huge mistake. Does it ruin the episode? No. The episode is still really good, but it was almost brilliant. And there's one thing that they did that I'm frustrated that they didn't realize it was a mistake, and it would have been so easy to fix. And it's going to sound like I'm going to be down on the episode, because I'm probably going to spend almost as long talking about this as I did just praising it. But I need to go through this anyway. So after the bar scene, Sylvie goes to the record store. She has her little interaction, and she starts listening to this record on headphones. And you can tell she's kind of going over everything in her head. She's contemplating everything. She isn't sure what she's going to do yet. And then the world around her starts to unravel. The spaghetti thing that we saw happen to Victor Timely is happening. The world that she chose, because she was someone who had a choice. Like, there's arguments to be had over most of the other characters. Do they have a choice? Did they? Should they? Should they make it? Should you? Sylvie absolutely had her own choice. The world she has chosen falls apart around her. Which means that when she returns to Loki and the other group, she's not making a choice. Her choice was removed. That feels like such a misstep. especially coming off the back of a conversation where choice was at the center of it. To have her pivot to go and help Loki again, not involve her making a choice. Because she can't choose to stay. There's nothing left here. Instead of having her have that conversation with Loki, sit down and contemplate her choices and potentially make a new one, or even decide to stick with the one that she did, we don't get that. Instead, the choice is made for her because one of the choices is removed. This would be so easy to fix. If you want to still have her go, you can still have this world unravel. Actually, you probably should, because it, ups the stakes and makes it clear this is happening. We weren't sure what would happen, but this is now what's happening. All you had to do was she's listening to the music. Everything starts unraveling behind her, but we see her and maybe we hear her say, I want to help, or I want to make a different choice, or I choose the TV. Just something to make clear that she is making a choice for herself. Then everything unravels. So you can still unravel it, but only after making it clear that she has made a choice, instead of putting her in a situation where the choice has been removed. And I suspect there are some who are going to argue that, well, that was what was going on in her head. Watching her facial performance, and it was clear she was uncertain. My read on her was that she did decide to leave, but then all this happened. Okay, that's possible, but I really think it should have been made explicit, especially if that was the intent. If the intent is to communicate that she is making a new choice, then you needed to make it explicit. Because, again, on the back of that bar scene, you have to have whatever she does in this scene be a choice that she makes, and you have to make it clear that she made it. I'm all for subtlety. I'm all for trusting the actor. I am all for leaving certain things up to interpretation. But sometimes you need to not have that much wiggle room, because sometimes when you leave something up to interpretation, it's open to multiple interpretations, all of which are valid and all of which work. But sometimes you leave something up to interpretation and you leave the door open for an interpretation that undermines what's working. And that's what I feel like is happening here. She should have made the choice. And even if you want to argue with me that she did, she just didn't say it out loud, I'm then going to say she should have. You should not have left the wiggle room to possibly have an interpretation of this be that her choice was stripped away from her yet again. I don't think that was the right call. I don't think that was the right call for the narrative within the episode, and I don't think that was the right call for her as a person. What it seems like they're doing is having the narrative inform her, you made the wrong choice and it didn't work, so we're going to force you back to the other one. What I feel very strongly they should have done was have her realize on her own, maybe I made the wrong choice, so I will now choose for me to do something else. And the fact that they didn't do that really does frustrate me. And I really feel like they should have recognized and done it, because it's right there. It's right there. And it reminds me of some of the frustration I had with season 1 when they didn't make Sylvie explicitly trans, because it would have massively reinforced her story, especially where she has gone since. If instead of, and it is arguable that maybe she is trans, we don't know, but she certainly was coded in certain ways that read as trans. She got upset at being called Loki in a similar way that someone might get upset at being called a dead name. But they left it in such a state in season 1 that it could be interpreted as, well, there's just a random woman Loki. Just like there's a random boy Loki. There's a random alligator Loki. One of them's just a woman. Where if she was trans, if she was a trans woman, that would have reinforced so much of her story and so many of the greater themes of this show that have continued on to go further in the second season, because it means that while a trans person does not choose who they are, she would have made a choice to live the life that is her own. Again, coming back to these ideas of choice. Now, I'm a little bit more forgiving about them not making her explicitly trans in season 1. I still consider it a missed opportunity, and not just for representation, for actually strengthening the narrative. I will argue that it's not just about having trans representation. It would have made her narrative stronger than it already was to have that be the case for her. But I'm slightly more forgiving of that because I accept that it is entirely possible that they wanted to do it and were vetoed. Now, I don't know that for certainty. I don't think anybody's come out and said that. But we do know for a fact that higher-ups at Disney have put the kibosh on explicit representation before. We know they've done it with Pixar. We know it's the reason they scrapped Nimona to later get picked up by Annapurna Studios and then get released on Netflix. We know that. Now, I don't think we know of it to a certainty any instances in Marvel where we know for certain Disney higher-ups went, no, you can't. But we know it has happened elsewhere. So I am willing to give some wiggle room on Sylvie not being explicitly trans, especially in season 1, because I could very easily believe that it was proposed and vetoed, or was suggested and they didn't even bother bringing it to Disney because they knew it would be vetoed. I could buy either one of those. This, though, this not having it be her choice to go to Loki again. And like, I suppose the other thing you could argue is like, well, she could have just stayed there alone, but she doesn't want to be alone. And she's not suicidal. So she's not going to stay there to be obliterated. She's not going to stay there to be alone. Those aren't valid choices for her as a character. So no, that doesn't work. All of her other options were stripped away. That's wrong. That's the wrong story for this episode. That's the wrong story for this character, especially for the conversation that was just had in the bar. As I said, I know I've gone on about this probably for as long, if not longer, as I did praising the thing. This is still a really good episode. Consider this to be kind of an extension of like the Uncanny Valley effect, where the more perfectly realistic something becomes, the more the tiny things that don't match up and the tiny flaws really jump out at you. Consider this to be the same thing. When an episode is this good, something that is out of whack and not lining up jumps out at me so much more than it might have in an episode that was merely mediocre. If this episode overall just had me going, oh, okay, then like I'd probably mention this and move on. But it bothers me because it stops a good episode from being an amazing episode. It's so close to being brilliant, and it would have been so easy to fix. Still a good episode. Still a good season. Still excited for the next episode, which I believe is the finale. I'm not going to make any particular speculation. I'm a little bit nervous now that Loki has jumped back. I will say within the boundaries of this episode, that was a good triumphant moment because it had been suggested before, like gain control of it, and they hadn't really talked about it since, and that to the point that if you're like me, you kind of forgot that he was working toward that because he'd given up on it, and that because they got the temp pad working. Oh, I also like the little touch that the temp pad door from OB's is like juddering around. It's a little janky. I like that. But I'd actually kind of forgotten that he'd been trying to do that. And then he's able to do it on command again. I'm like, oh, that's good and triumphant. It's a good ending for this episode. I am a little nervous going into the next episode, which again, I think is the finale. I'm a little bit nervous that they're going to do some of the stuff that I was pleasantly surprised that they didn't do back in the previous episode, back in episode 4. Like something Loki does here is going to cause Victor Timely to become He Who Remains. Like, that's kind of my immediate prediction. I don't want that to happen. I want Victor Timely to remain anomalous within the scope of variations of Kang. I kind of want that at this point. Even though I don't super love the character or the characterization, I would like him to remain anomalous because otherwise it paints a picture of fate, that any version of him is fated to be a monster. And I don't want the show to lean into that, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. Like, I'm not saying he has to live or come back. He can die. Heck, he can be killed by a worse version of him. I'll buy that. I just kind of don't want to see this version of Kang become Kang. So I'm a little bit nervous that they're going to end up doing that in the next episode. But then again, they've consistently surprised me across this season. So we'll see. Loki, episode 5 of season 2. What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't support me that way, like, share, subscribe. They all help me out. Don't worry too much about it, though. We take a relaxed attitude around here, so you can just come on back next time you need a break. Time to thank some Patreon backers, and in the spirit of October, I'd like to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfulla, Goddess Alita, Turok, The Thing That Goes Doink in the Anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernobulax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrappett, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, and Rosalind Bennett. Thank you for your assistance. I don't know, I might try theming the shoutouts in the future. I don't know, we'll see. Thank you.